Hi everyone. In this third video from our unit, Business and the Environment, I will be talking about how business can protect the environment. So in the previous video, we were looking at what governments can do. Now we'll be looking at what businesses can do. But remember, there's a lot of regulation that businesses also already have to follow, particularly in countries like the United States, where these issues, environmental issues, have been talked about for a long time and where government has been pressured to act for a long time. We learned in the last video that command and control regulation sets minimum standards and the government enforces compliance with those standards. And so businesses operating in America today have to follow already a lot of laws, a lot of rules around the environment. In addition to that, we learned about different ways in which the U.S. government is trying to encourage companies to go above and beyond what's legally required. But I want you to stop and think for a moment, just from a management perspective, what incentives do companies have to improve their environmental performance beyond what is legally required? In other words, why not just satisfy legal requirements and have that be it? Can sustainability management serve as a source of competitive advantage? Can you get a competitive edge over another firm through sustainability? Think about that. We'll be addressing that question again at the end of this video. So in response to all of the different global environmental challenges we talked about in the first video in this series, you'll see numerous voluntary initiatives being undertaken by companies around the world to put the principle of sustainable development into practice. So I'm sure that you guys can think of examples, companies you've read about in the newspaper, or initiatives you may have learned about through marketing communications, from advertisements from companies and products, services that you like. So companies are doing a lot of things on a voluntary basis to address environmental challenges, and we'll look at a few of those examples now. So one of them is life cycle analysis. Life cycle analysis involves collecting information on the lifelong environmental impact of a product, from extraction of raw materials, to manufacturing, to distribution, the use of the product, and ultimately its disposal. So for one example, Tide detergent. Tide detergent, the company did a life cycle analysis of the product to figure out where the largest environmental impacts were in the life cycle. And it turned out that one of the biggest impacts came as people were using it because of all of the warm water that people were using with Tide detergent. As a result, Tide decided to develop a detergent that could be used optimally with tap water, so that the water wouldn't have to be warm, and therefore reduced substantially the environmental impact of the product. But that only came because they were thinking about the environmental impact at every stage of the product in its life cycle. Tide could have said, hey, once we sell you this detergent, we're no longer responsible for any other environmental impacts. The use of the product, that's up to you. But instead, they chose to think realistically about how the product is going to be used, disposed, etc., and make changes to the product to reduce the environmental impact all the way through the life cycle. Another example of a voluntary business initiative aimed at improving the environment is industrial ecology. So this refers to designing factories and distribution systems as if they were self-contained ecosystems. So, in an ecosystem, there is no waste. Every output from one system is an input for another within this larger system. So this is the idea of industrial ecology is to try to apply that, let's say, to a factory, where waste from one part of operations in the factory can be used for another purpose somewhere else. So to minimize waste within the manufacturing process, let's say. Another initiative is extended product responsibility. So similar to life cycle analysis, companies really thinking through what happens over the life of the product. So taking responsibility for the environmental impact of the product and services even after they're sold. So, for example, with Volkswagen, They realized that the cars that they produce are only going to last so long. So let's think ahead to when the car can no longer be driven. How easily can somebody break down this car into its component parts to reuse or recycle those parts? And so Volkswagen cars are designed and built with that in mind, and that's an example of this extended product responsibility. Carbon neutrality. So an organization or an individual produces net zero emission of greenhouse gases. This is usually accomplished by a combination of energy efficiencies and carbon offsets. So carbon neutrality doesn't necessarily mean that a business organization is not emitting any carbon into the atmosphere. What it means is although it may be reducing to the greatest extent those emissions, what it does mean is that the net emissions of all of their activities is zero. So you get your emissions as low as possible. You see what those emissions are, and you try to offset them by giving money to other organizations, or doing this yourself, but mainly it's to other organizations to plant trees, which absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, or to develop other technologies that make further emission reductions possible. These are different ways to offset the carbon that you are emitting into the atmosphere. So JetBlue offers an example of this. If you want, you think about your air travel. Obviously, people aren't using planes right now, but you take a flight across the country, that results in a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions. JetBlue will let you calculate what it would cost to offset those emissions, again by funding other initiatives somewhere else, like planting trees. And so other organizations do this as well, as a way to appear more environmental, sustainable for their consumers, and to take this idea of carbon neutrality seriously. Finally, technology cooperation. So this is sustainable development through long-term partnerships between businesses in developed and developing countries that transfer environmental technologies. So there are all kinds of examples of this. This is one in the reading, Schneider Electric partnering with a French NGO to provide villagers in rural Vietnam with solar power. So there are many different examples of this, but these challenges, environmental challenges, are not just challenges for the United States, they're challenges for the entire planet. And so that involves bringing as many people into the solution as possible. And technology transfer is really important in this respect. So around renewable energy, it's not enough that Americans have energy from renewable sources. We want everybody around the planet to be doing this, or those who are really advocating this, that's what they want. And so companies can help in that through diffusing this technology in a variety of different ways. So let's get back to that original question, sustainability management as a competitive advantage. So why go beyond compliance? Well, in other words, why do more than what's legally required? Well, businesses have a variety of reasons to make that step. The first is cost savings. So a lot of environmental impacts can be avoided in ways that also reduce cost for businesses. So you think about just turning the lights off at night. That means there's less energy consumption and less consumption of non-renewable resources, for example, fewer emissions into the atmosphere, but it also means the company's paying for less power, so it's saving money. Brand differentiation. So, if you have two products that are otherwise very similar, but one is associated with sustainable management and one's not, that one was produced taking certain environmental impacts into consideration and one was not, that could be useful for consumers that value the environment and would perhaps make a decision based on that factor, all other things being equal. Technological innovation. So in trying to reduce your emissions, you also might be getting more efficient. There are other technologies that you could be developing, or the technologies you're developing could have other benefits to the bottom line other than simply reducing emissions. So there's sort of an argument just for innovating and staying one step ahead of your competition. The reduction of regulatory and liability risk. So this is avoiding expensive fines and lawsuits. As we talked about previously, government has a variety of rules and penalties for those companies that violate the rules. So by making sure that you are far exceeding what's legally required, you make it a lot less likely that you would be fined or that somebody would sue you, for example. And then finally, we have strategic planning. So just thinking about the long-term profitability of a business. What is going to be, what is this business, challenges this business is going to be facing down the road? Environmental thinking, sustainability management, this is in the long-term best interest of the company from many people's point of view. So actually in a lot of cases we see environmental or sustainability management being taken by analysts as a proxy for management in general in a company. So companies that are taking these issues seriously, that's good for the environment, but analysts also see that as just being an indication of good, smart management.